Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Henry Schein Dental Academy webinar series. My name is Adam, and I'll be your moderator. Today, we're joined by two experts in their own trades. We have Eric Pook with Sears Consulting, as well as Dr. Tom Snyder with Henry Schein Professional Practice Transitions. Eric and Tom will be sharing tips on how to streamline the sale of your practice and protect its value through the dental office lease. At any point during the webinar, if there are questions, please type them into the Q&A section of your control panel, and we'll answer them live at the end of the presentation. Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation live or on demand, and this webinar is sponsored by Henry Schein's Dental Business Institute, as well as Sears Consulting and Henry Schein Professional Practice Transitions. So Eric, I will throw it over to you.
Welcome, everyone. Certainly, we've got a very special event planned for this evening, one that I've been looking forward to now for well over a year since the last time Dr. Snyder and I presented through one of these. And it really does pertain around some of the top questions we get about transitioning doctors, or it's also the top phone call we get when things tend to go wrong. So tonight is really about proactive planning and help to having some proactive investment in planning versus reactive cost. So it is an absolute thrill and pleasure to introduce Dr. Tom Snyder. He is the Senior Director at Henry Schein's Professional Practice Transitions. He's a former department chair at the University of Maryland School of Dentistry, and truly an expert in his field. He's a nationally recognized speaker, author, and consultant who's been advising clients for over 30 years in the dental practice strategic planning, practice valuations, and dental partnership formation. Dr. Snyder received his DMD from the University of Pennsylvania School of Dental Medicine and his MBA from the Wharton School Graduate Division at the University of Pennsylvania. So certainly welcome, Dr. Snyder. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Eric. I'm glad to be here, and good evening, everybody.
Fantastic. So we certainly, I think between 3 a.m. and 7 a.m., we had hundreds and hundreds of registrants. So first of all, welcome for joining, and certainly thank you for joining us here at 7 p.m. on the East Coast for obviously a lot of early risers. So just to get a bit of a sense of the room as people are still joining, we've got a quick poll just to help customize some of the content. We're going to be really focusing on Q&A and making things as interactive as possible this evening. So as a form, you should see a quick intro poll. If you're on the road, please don't poll and drive. But first question is just to describe a little bit about your situation. Are you planning to open or relocate? Are you planning to acquire? Are you planning to transition and sell within the next 5 years? Are you planning to just stay put, or none of the above? And also a sense of intent for this evening, purpose of joining. And then also for those of you that do have a lease, when does that expire? And that would be those with a lease for a building that they don't own, for example. In addition, question 4, if they do plan to start or buy a practice. And last but not least, there were a number of requests initially as that initial registration went out for those interested about learning more about their lease and or what the local rents are for their location. I see a few good questions already starting to come through. So just for a point of process, the Q&A section is open and we will have a full time for Q&A towards the end. There's also the chat feature, but I would encourage you to use the Q&A section so we can cover each one as we go and certainly pick Dr. Snyder's brain for 30 years worth of experience in exactly these types of situations. Perfect. Great. All right, let's jump in. We've got lots to cover this evening. So again, purpose of this evening is to how to protect the sale and value of your practice through the dental office lease. Now, you might just think that's just for those that are leasing their space, but equally important, especially with the impact of COVID-19, especially for those that own their real estate and are contemplating selling their practice and remaining as a full-time landlord, this is absolutely relevant to you as well. So thank you for joining. Okay, quick sort of lineup of what we have in store is a national update. What's happening in the marketplace? What do we see now from a impact of COVID as we're coming through, bar none, hopefully, knock on wood, the far side, Delta variant notwithstanding, to talk about revenues, earnings, selling prices, etc. and hearing that right from Dr. Snyder, that every day is doing valuations and beyond. We'll talk about some of the economics, how we compare, and the real cost of some of the clauses that might be buried deep within your lease and the impact for those. Also, we'll touch on some of the core clauses to look out for and some of the key things that you would want to focus on well in advance of transition to ensure that you're minimizing the landlord's impact on the ability to sell. In addition to that, talking about how to avoid some of the $100,000 mistakes that can be found within your dental office lease. So for those of you following along, if you're on your laptop and you have a digital copy of your original lease and or any of the recent amendments, that one from 1986 that you might have signed way back when is and may still be the governing lease if you've just renewed it ever since. And also talking about how to mitigate risk and exposure post-sale, right? And especially helping to protect the estate if, heaven forbid, something were to happen to you. All right, on that note, for those of you that haven't joined one of our webinars before or heard of us before, we're unique. We're a very hyper-specialized firm. We're the only firm of our kind in North America that is specialized as a tenant representation firm specifically for healthcare and dental. Uniquely, we were founded now over 27 years ago by dentists for dentists with over 12,000 leases under our belt. We have attorneys on staff as well as some of our experts have been with us now, helping and supporting our clients now for over 18 years, some people on staff. So from that perspective, we're privileged to be one of the lecturers at Henry Schein's Dental Business Institute and Dental Business Institute on Demand, and really look forward to sharing some of these core components of over the 25,000 leases that we've seen through our tenure. So to start things off, let's look at it from the owner's perspective. So for those of you that own or are contemplating purchasing real estate in the future, let's look at it from the buyer side, and then let's look at it from the seller side. So obviously from the buyer side, it does tie up a significant amount of capital. And for those of you that are in the buyer's market and are joining this to be able to try to see where the sellers are, where the buyers are, it can certainly have a major impact to capital. As we know, a lot of the large dental groups or otherwise would much rather keep that operating company and keep those dollars investing in acquiring or adding a new location rather than tying up that capital in real estate. And number two is, you become a landlord. And there's pros and cons with that. But in many cases, when things go wrong or there's asbestos or you need to make a renovation or there's an issue with the roof or otherwise, you're the one to call. And if you have other tenants, then you may know that can be an even bigger bone of contention. Obviously, you're now paying from one pocket or the other, which can certainly be beneficial. And you have the flexibility to choose how and where you use the space and the freedom to control the property. But also you lose some of that flexibility. And I've spoken to many doctors that had both owned, right, and built out, bought the building and built out the practice. And with COVID, right, they had double committed and really stretched themselves quite thin. Obviously on the leasing side, again, looking at it from the buyer's perspective, there can be a great benefit in terms of much lower upfront payment. It's the ability to assess a specific market or area or mall. And the ability to come in with lower capital to be able to make the investments necessary to build that business, and obviously a lot more flexibility to expand. So now let's look at it from the seller side. So regardless of buying or leasing, the dental office lease still becomes a critical component. And you might think of, well, hey, why do I need a lease if I own my own space? However, there are many reasons. There can be reasons to make sure that you're paying yourself fair rent, right? So there's not a taxation type of issue. So you're accountant for that. In addition to that, obviously from a liability perspective, also important to understand which entity is responsible for what within the space or outside the space. In addition, right, how do we help to maximize the value of your building and how to help to maximize the value of the practice? So this is a quick little exercise that we do with a group that goes through the Dental Business Institute at Henry Schein's headquarters. So just on a blank sheet of paper, you can run through these. Who owns your building? Is it yourself personally, your spouse, or a corporation? Who owns your practice? Again, is it yourself, spouse, family member, or a corporation? Number three is ask yourself, are you paying yourself rent today? If so, what amount? And is it really whatever you can afford at the end of the month or the year? Is it what your accountant sort of advises you at one point? Or is it, regimented based on a specific payment that is bound by a specific document, such as the lease? Also, how are you tracking your expenses? Are you using your same credit card to, buy a handpiece from Henry Schein as you are to, fix the plumbing? So these are the type of things to be looking at, because as you're looking towards transitioning, it can be that much more difficult to separate the financials, especially if you're looking to maintain ownership of the building as a passive form of income, and then just looking to sell the practice. And obviously far better when looking to sell to say, look, here's the lease that I've always been using myself. Let me just transfer that on to you, Dr. Smith, who's buying your practice. Is there a lease in place today? If so, who created it? Many doctors either had their accountant do it, right, in a quick little paragraph, or downloaded something online, right, which does create a lot of potential issues, especially if, heaven forbid, something were to happen to you. Do you plan to keep the building? And just really rate yourself now. Looking at some of these questions, rate the state of your estate on a scale of 1 to 10. Okay, for those of you that lease your space today, so these are some key questions to make sure that in your phones today, you're tracking some of these key dates. Number one is, when does your lease expire? Very critically important. Number two is, when is your option to renew deadline? A lot of doctors are unaware that if they miss exercising that option, basically giving specific or written notice that may need to be couriered to the landlord's specific office, but many don't realize that if they miss that, they then, unfortunately, are now responsible for those options become null and void, right? And they think that, hey, I've got 2 other 5-year options, but unfortunately, that now might not be the case. In addition to that, so those are the 2 things to put in. When does your lease expire? If you have options, when those expire. And typically, you want to complete your lease negotiations prior to that expiry date for the lease, for the option to renew deadline. Number 3 is when. When do you want to transition or sell? Dr. Snyder will share that we're aligned with philosophies that typically 10 years out is one of the best times to start making sure that all your things are correct. Why 10 years? Well, first of all, depending on the term of the lease, right? The lease is one of the main factors. So you want to make sure you've got one significant renegotiation perspective of your lease prior to that eventual transition time. Also very relevant, because many of the major banks and their individual underwriters will not issue a long-term loan if there's only a few years on the lease. So the lease and the term of the lease becomes very important to the buyer. Of course, it's the continuity and predictability of your revenue that is one of the main values, is what your buyer is buying, is to make sure that they buy it, they get the keys, and the patients still show up, right? Ultimately, that's what they're looking for. And therefore, the lease is a key component. Imagine if, right, that buyer or you drove to the office tomorrow, turned the key, right, and there was a brown envelope that said, unfortunately, you're a month-to-month tenant and we've decided to go elsewhere. And therefore you, right, Dr. Smith, are no longer, and here's your 30 days notice to exit the premises. Some other questions that, especially for those on the West Coast, there's a lot of landlords that will make the options personal, meaning that you might have a 10-year term with 2 5-year options, but those options are specific to you and your name, right? Dr. Tom Snyder, for example. And therefore, if you were to go to sell, you might think, well, sure, I've got at least another 10 years, Tom, no problems. However, right, if you're at year 9 and those options are personal, then for the buyer, all there is a year left. So very important to look through the option language for those of you following along. Another question we got a lot during the past 12 and 24 months through COVID is specifically about liability and who has signed a lease. Is it in your name personally or your corporation? And also, have you signed a personal guarantee? Meaning that in the event of a dispute with the landlord or lack of rent payment, that then puts you and your personal assets potentially in harm's way. Also, another big one to look at is the continuing liability clause, which we'll touch on tonight as well, which is specifically that even after you sell, many don't realize, but they may also be continually liable right, as the lease continues to renew up until the point that there's a new lease in place. Basically, you're now doing the equivalent of signing the lease of your neighbor's son's car and then moving out of state, right? You are still just as liable as you were practicing, even if you were to sell and completely walk away and retire. Also, does your landlord have a demolition or relocation right? Many look at that, many buyers look at that and say, okay, well, look, if there's a risk that I might have to relocate this practice after a certain period of time, then they would look at a $200 or $250 per square foot charge or fee that they would need additional capital at year 4 or year 5, right, in order to facilitate that because of the lack of contract, the lack of predictability through that. So again, for those of you in the leasing situation, you can self-rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 on your knowledge and or state of the estate as you plan to transition. Okay, so just to dig into those a little bit further, a few components here are, number one is the assignment clause. The assignment clause is one of the first things when you go to get your practice valuated or you go to sell your practice. This is one of the core components. Typically as a condition of sale, let it be financing, but also there needs to be that assignment of the lease. As I mentioned before, the incoming doctor needs to have that predictability to know that they're going to be able to stay in that space. So that's the assignment clause. We're going to go through that in more detail and actually pull up a recent example to share. Rental rate increases can be an interesting one. Many don't realize that the landlord may have the option to dramatically increase the rental price. If they feel that you're underpaying today, right, there might be a clause in the lease that would allow them to bring it back to market rent or to renegotiate rent at the time of assignment. The consideration clause, this is a biggie, which we'll spend some time touching on in some recent examples. But yes, many of you may have heard some examples through dental communities or otherwise, where the landlord is entitled to a percentage of your practice sale proceeds. And that is typically found in the consideration language. Yes, that is more than an urban myth. It is unfortunately very real and does impact many doctors. Another interesting component for those of you thinking of just walking away and selling charts, that might be the right option for you, depending on your situation. But also be cautious about your existing lease. It might not be as easy as just dropping the keys off. In many cases, the lease, let it be either through the surrender or the restoration language, might specifically require you to return it to pre-dental condition or to remove the leaseholds at the landlord's discretion prior to walking away. So yes, that could be another 10 or 15 plus $1,000 of demolition just to walk away. Another big component we'll spend some time touching on is the death and disability clause. And this is important, especially as you're now looking to the next stage and looking to transition over the next 15, 20 plus years, is again, with COVID, to expect the unexpected. What would happen if you happen to pass away tomorrow? What impact would that have? Meaning, in your lease today, there is the section that is typically then binding to your successors and heirs. So that in the event, if you were to pass, right, that liability of the remaining term can pass on to your estate. The death and disability clause is something that can be very important, right? That if something were to happen to you or your ability to practice wet finger dentistry, obviously a definition of disabled might not be applicable, but you might not be able to actually practice wet finger dentistry. So from that perspective, right, the death and disability clause is something that we helped craft now 27 years ago of dental specific language to, again, protect yourself in the event of death or some form of disability preventing you from practice. And that can either be a demolition right, or a termination right within 60 days notice of either yourself or the estate, or the ability not to be held in default to allow your estate to be able to transition the practice. There was a terrible example north of our office a doctor, 43 years of age, had built out a beautiful practice. 3 weeks prior to the grand opening, had passed away due to a massive heart attack. Wife and child had no real involvement with the practice. So you got a fully built out practice. No doctor, no patients. How much is that practice worth? Unfortunately, zero. And in this case, less than zero. The landlord said, unfortunately, you know what, Mrs. Smith, you're now responsible for not only the $9,000 a month rental payments, but the remaining 9.5 years on the lease. And in addition, that increases at 4% per year. So as you're looking forward to the future, the death and disability clause is just one of many to ensure that you're aware of not only what's in your lease, but also what's not in your lease today. Personal guarantees we touched on, and many of the financial terms as well. 7 main financial variables that, especially being mid-career: base rent, annual increase, common area maintenance, fixturing, free rent, tenant improvement allowance, landlord work, right? There's lots of areas to be able to leverage the high degree of vacancies going on in North America and use that to your advantage. Okay, so now for part 2 of this section, let's get into the practical component. So this is talking about the importance of the properly structured assignment clause. So this is found in about 75% of dental leases. So again, those of you following along or joining from home and you've got your laptop up, or those on the West Coast that are joining again from the office, this is a key section to look at. Typically, it's about 3/4 of the way through the lease and hidden somewhere towards the back. So take a quick moment and have a quick read through this and try to identify some of the specific red flags. At this point in our in-person seminars, I usually ask how many enjoy reading leases. It's the equivalent of myself reading a book on advanced endodontic procedures, not my kettle of fish. But needless to say, it's a lot through here to be aware of. So up first, did you notice this? The first section here is that if the tenant, you, should wish to assign or sublet the lease premises, meaning to sell and then therefore transfer the lease, or to bring in a 1099 associate or someone to sublet a portion of the space, it shall first have received the consent of the landlord. So many don't realize that they will be unable to sell the practice without the landlord's written consent. Number 2. Did you notice this for bonus points? Within 15 days following the receipt by the landlord of such request, so you want to sell, you reach out to the landlord to say, look, I've got a buyer, I've gone through the full valuation process, I've gone through all the back and forth, the lawyers have done their work, you know what, we just need to assign the lease as one of the last things. Well, now the landlord has the option within 15 days to, number 1, approve the request to sign and transfer the lease to your buyer, or 2, to come back and decline, with or without reason, your request to assign the lease and sublet the premises, or number 3, to terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date of such proposed lease assignment or sublet. So yes, just for asking to sell, just for asking to transfer the lease, you might be 1 year into a 10-year term, but just for asking to sell, the landlord has the ability to terminate the lease, and then in some cases engage directly with your buyer. So ask yourself, how much is your practice worth now if you suddenly didn't have a lease to sell? If you didn't have a location is your business is your location, and therefore, the depreciated value of your assets and equipment and charts. So hopefully today we're starting to have an appreciation of the importance of the dental office lease. Point number 3, the landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of, I love that, the greater of the then current market rent for the lease premises, or 15% greater than the current rent. So in essence, it gives, if you were given a great deal, the landlord may have put this into the language that allows them to dramatically ratchet up the lease, for the next tenant. So they did the deal for you, but that may not be applicable to your buyer. Now imagine at the 11th hour of selling your practice, and suddenly the landlord wants a 15% increase in rent. What would that do to the buyer? Well, typically, unfortunately, it sends them running. Number 4. Now, this was a key component. This is the consideration clause we were touching on before. So should the tenant receive from the assignee or subtenant any rental income, cash, right, goods, or any form of consideration in connection with the assignment of this lease or sublet of the premises, that this is over and above the current base rental rates payable to the landlord in any fiscal year during the term of this lease, then the difference between that rent and the sale and the cash received for that sale and assignment, right, will be paid directly to the landlord within 30 days of the tenant's receipt thereof. Yes, so by definition, I see lots of questions coming in now. It's typically about the time that there is. Yes, the landlord may be entitled to a percentage of those proceeds, which is obviously not the intent behind this. The intent typically is they don't want someone else profiting from what they feel is their profits. Now, obviously, they look at it that it's not your blood, sweat, and tears over the years that have resulted in the value of your practice, but it's actually their foot traffic, it's their building, it's their location that's the value. Right? So from that perspective, again, very important. So by definition, if you sell your practice for $1 million and your rent is $100,000, the landlord can, right, therefore come after $900,000 based on this type of language. And I was just sharing with Dr. Tom Snyder before a specific example that happened to a client of ours that with one of the practices that he ended up selling to a DSO, one of 4, had sold that off, right? Unfortunately, it was an older mall that was up for redevelopment, been around since the 60s. That landlord absolutely refused to transfer the lease. And in the end, as an adjustment on close, it cost that doctor $140,000 just for the landlord to agree to assign the lease. Right? But for a $2 million sale, made sense, but it took a haircut of $140,000 just because of a few sentences within the lease. Last but not least, the notwithstanding the landlord's consent, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant within this lease. So yes, this is the continuing liability clause. So even if you sell, even if you transfer the lease and you walk away and you enjoy retirement, many don't realize that they may be corporately or personally liable because, right, you are now transferring that lease. And the landlord would say, well, why, right? What's wrong with Dr. Smith? Why would you not want to, or are they not going to pay their rent? Why would you not want to backstop them, right? So again, very important you're aware of these. So here's one clause, right? And the impact of this obviously could not only impact your sale, right, but it could impact hundreds of thousands of dollars of potential value. A specific example, a personal client of mine who was a doctor that at 73 at the time was trying to sell a practice. She tried to sell her practice 3 separate times. Each and every time the landlord found a reason to come back and say no. So she therefore hired us. We then had to relocate her 10 minutes north. And as a result, we were very lucky to be able to negotiate the landlord to build out the entire new build out of her practice at the landlord's expense. But unbelievably, can you imagine at 74 years of age, having to relocate your practice just in order to facilitate the sale? So these are just one of the hundreds of 5-star Google reviews that you can see for more specifics. And then Dr. Snyder's going to go through some more case examples here shortly. So again, the cost of this, inability to sell, absorb significant increase in rent, right? Remaining liable or guarantor even after the sale, right? Who needs that stress? Paying the landlord a percentage of your proceeds as well. So this is one section that in the essence of time, we won't dig into too deeply, but this is certainly something to be very aware of. And from that perspective, you can certainly, usually this is where the doctors pull out their phones and take lots of photos when we do some in-person events. But this is important. You really need to be aware of all the different components within the lease, right? You need to be aware of, some may even be in default because of changes they made through COVID without the landlord's consent, or perhaps there was a rent deferral or abatement that may or may not have been documented. There's a whole host of things, right? Is there a demolition or relocation right? That death and disability, right? Is there a requirement to return it to pre-dental condition? If you are in a month-to-month lease, I can't stress enough, you'll have an option to alert us if it's an urgent situation. If you are in a month-to-month lease, makes the transition potentially incredibly difficult because now there is no term to transfer. And also many don't realize, but there's a holdover or overholding section that in some cases the landlords have the ability to increase rent by 150 or 200% for any of the months that you're in that month-to-month holdover type of situation. Lots of others, rules and regulations, subordination, non-disturbance, exclusivity, right? Do you have exclusivity in your lease? Right? From a buyer's perspective, doesn't mean much for you, but for the buyer, that could be very valuable to know that a DSO isn't going to plant their flag right next door in the future or shortly after they buy. Also, another interesting component, financial statements. Some doctors, when they requested help through COVID, through last March, April, and May, many landlords, smart, reach out to the doctors to say, sure, but first send me all your last 3 years of federal income tax statements and all your financials. Right? And the doctor said, whoa, well, hang on a second. Oh, maybe I'll just keep paying rent. But many didn't realize that within the lease, if you did not submit that to the landlord for any reason, within 10 business days, you could be found in default of the lease. So to summarize, before passing on to my esteemed colleague, the cycle. What can we do? What's the solution? Number one, proactive planning, right? The tenant lease cycle. This is what they teach landlords. This is a slide stolen from what they teach landlords, which is, the best thing for the tenant is to start at least 24 to 30 months prior to expiry. What do many landlords do? They defer, they wait, oh, we're golfing, oh, it's too soon. Then 12 months pass. Then suddenly your option to renew deadline comes up, right? And you're getting frustrated, you're trying to get things going, the landlord keeps pushing you off. And in some cases, they don't remind you, you're busy chairside, you forget. Now suddenly those options have become null and void. If you get into the red, right, you've lost so much leverage as a result. So typically prior to transition, 10 to 15 years in advance, helping to make sure that things like the lease are properly structured. For those buyers, I'm sure that's the last thing you're thinking of. But when you get into a business opportunity, always think the exit. So start early. And typically our approach is to be proactive with proposals and beyond. So as we can conclude the first section here, number one is doctors can't stress enough. If you don't have a digital copy of the lease co-signed by the landlord, it's not worth the paper or digital paper that it's written on. So I would strongly recommend just emailing your landlord and saying, I'd like a digital copy of my lease and any of the amendments, and they should have all that on file and can email it back very quickly. Know what you've signed, know what your obligations are. And yes, it might be back to that lease in 1986 is where that original assignment section is. Number two, think about the goals. What do you really want? What does that transition look like? Number three is have your lease reviewed. At least understand what the risks are and what the potential pitfalls are early. Number four is get the market research. A lot of doctors go into their renewal negotiations without knowing what all the comparable rental rates are, or having a real estate expert be able to pull up all the vacancy rates, rental rate reports, etc., to know exactly what is fair or not. And then number five is determine what that eventual outcome is. It's a carefully choreographed game of chess. You want to be thinking 7 or 8 steps ahead. Unfortunately, what do most doctors do? They skip sections 1 through 5, pick up the phone and call the landlord and say, okay, great, I want to start renegotiating my lease. Right? Basically skipping all the steps and putting them in a lot less leverage. Then negotiating the financial terms, business terms, and making sure that everything is finally signed off and countersigned by all parties. So as I pass it on, there'll be an option for this at the end, but certainly an appreciation for your time. We waive the fee for our critical dates and risk analysis. So if you are concerned about some of these clauses or what may be in your lease, you can certainly email us at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, or there'll be an additional poll section when you exit or at the end of the webinar here today. Perfect. So again, as mentioned before, I could not be more pleased to introduce my colleague and co-speaker today, Dr. Tom Snyder, to really discuss the importance of the lease and really leveraging it from his expertise of over 30 years in the transition business. Tom, over to you.
Eric, thank you. Excellent presentation. As you can see, they place a premium on careful planning. And so do we with our transition planning. But tonight, we're going to kind of look at what we see as valuators and brokers. Because obviously, if there are problems with the lease, it could impact your practice value. And more importantly, if you're a potential seller, your closing may be delayed, or maybe you won't even make it to the closing table, all because of that lease. So it's so important that that information be assimilated by you and taken seriously, because we see the output, which oftentimes is negative when people haven't done proper planning and review, and it's crunch time, and especially the landlords can really take advantage of the situation, and it will cost you. So let's take a look. For those of you who heard me speak over the last year, we've talked about the impact of COVID on dental practices. Next slide, please. And I've referenced numerous times the American Dental Association's survey. They had a panel which started back in March of 2020. Over 10,000 dentists were approached. Some of you taking this broadcast may be regular participants. And every few weeks, they would do another panel. And they would ask a series of questions, tracking data, getting opinions. And halfway through the process, they got involved with a company that deals with patients. So they've been tracking a lot of data. So I wanted to just cover, just for a minute or two, some of the high points, because they're all good. Now, hopefully all of you have seen tremendous rebounds in your practices. And this information came from the most recent panel, which was reported just last week. And so if you look at that, you'll see that essentially the majority of practices are at 88% of patient volume compared to pre-pandemic at the end of Q2. So that means that a lot of the patients who weren't coming in because you were closed, or for fear of catching COVID because of the lack of vaccination and all the types of things that prohibited patients from becoming to see you, a lot of people have come back, and come back in droves, to the extent that economic confidence is real high with dentists. And I think be interesting to see how you compare with that return. Interesting though, that we find, even though the averages are averages, that in the top 20 cities, the patient volume has returned only to about 85%, because in some of the major cities, especially in the Northeast, we had longer closure rates. We had people migrating out of the city, going to second homes, patients not coming to the office. Whereas in the suburban areas, 91%, and in the rural areas, 90%. So we see kind of some stratification, but bottom line is that things are coming back a lot better than most of us thought. Most of us were really uncertain. We were uncertain about how we were going to value practices this year, but all kinds of good things are happening, and it's all positive for a change. There is one area that's a bit of a struggle, and some of you may be facing that, and it's the lack of dental staff in certain markets. Hygienists are the ones that are the highest in demand and the hardest to find, because there was about a 4% loss in the hygiene workforce as of COVID, and that group has not come back. Whether they will or not remains to be seen. Also, dental assistants are hard to find, and in some markets, associates. So from the research the ADA is doing, they feel that the employee shortage issue is going to be around with us for a while, and many of you are frustrated because you're getting busier, but you don't have the team to staff it. So when we look at Q3 and Q4, the question was asked of the doctors in the survey, how do they feel about the rest of the year? And overwhelmingly, extremely bullish. Hopefully you feel the same way looking at your practice, because some of you may be well ahead of where you were even in 2019. As I mentioned, the ADA also partnered with a consumer research firm and found that the dental patients too are bullish on going back to the dentist. Interestingly though, in the survey, the one medical specialty, and they termed dentistry a medical specialty, that was not as utilized as much as others was dentistry. 34% of patients really stayed away from the dentist compared to those, like, for example, a primary care physician at 24%. So what does that mean? And some of you are seeing that now. Patients have pent up demand. There's a lot of dentistry that still needs to be done. And more importantly, from a long-term perspective, patients are telling the researchers that they intend to become regular utilizers of care, meaning if they were on a 2 or 3 recall cycle, they're going to go back to that. So that's all good news. So happy to see that. And I'm sure that you're all hopefully beginning to see that in your practice as well. Now, when it comes to practice values, again, a year ago, you heard me speak, we had no idea where we were going to head with this pandemic. And would dental practices drop like a rock? Would buyers be afraid to purchase practices? Well, guess what? We see not much of a difference. As a matter of fact, we still see high values, particularly as we look at 2021. And when we value practices, we don't take a critical eye at 2020 because most of you had a downturn. So how have you rebounded? How strong are you? What do you look like going into 2021? And so we're finding a very strong market for practice values, getting high marks in that regard. Practice sales. There's a lot of young doctors out there who had a lot of time to think about when they were unemployed as an employee or on unemployment and saying, okay, I'm paying off my student loans. I want to own something. I don't want to be at the whim of an employer who says we're not busy enough or we had to close the office or whatever the case may be. They want to be in control of their own destiny. So we're finding a lot of purchasers now that are ready to step up to the plate and buy dental practices, which is good for many of you who are thinking of selling. Also, banks are readily out there. There's plenty of cash and interest rates are still at a relatively low rate. So doctors can afford to buy practices. So that's all good news as far as where we are in our dental profession. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So obviously, Eric has given you a lot of good information, excellent information on reviewing your lease and being proactive and doing proper planning. And so as brokers, we deal with people who haven't done their homework, who are on month-to-month leases or have assignment clause problems and settlement gets held up or doesn't occur. And one of the big issues that we try to make sure of is there going to be any future liability of the seller? Because the last thing we need is a seller to go to closing, get paid a fair market value, and have liability issues on the lease, particularly if, God forbid, the purchaser runs into trouble. So as Eric mentioned, getting those issues resolved is so important so there's no hiccups after you sell your practice. Also, it's important too to have an existing lease and get a renewal as opposed to drawing up a new lease. Because if you have to draw up a new lease with the landlord, chances are they're not going to give you the same deal that the landlord's not going to give you the same deal that they gave you. They're going to try to extract more. And as Eric mentioned, particularly if they offered some abatement or some good deals to get you to become a tenant years ago, they're going to get caught up. They're going to end up charging more. And of course, a buyer starts looking at that and they get nervous. And we've seen deals fall apart right before closing because we couldn't get a really good lease for the purchaser. They said, it's not worth it. I don't want all this extra cost, and I'll move on to another practice where I can get something else. And of course, as Eric mentioned, lenders also are, really take a close look at the lease because they want to have their debt service covered. So that becomes really, really important. Right at the end, Eric mentioned this consideration clause, the kicker. We find this particularly in urban areas where the landlords want to get a little kicker as far as the sale of the practice. Again, it's amazing how many dentists just go through the process of being a tenant and don't look at these documents because all they do is pay their rent. When it's time to sell, all of a sudden you pay the piper. So that's another thing that needs to be looked at that we sometimes see that can really kind of really foul up a deal. So Eric wanted me to share with you a few horror stories because we could spend the whole evening with what we see in our world as brokers. Here's one that just happened very recently. Practice, $1.4 million practice, buyer and seller got along extremely well, negotiated the purchase agreement, bank financing was fully in place. We were right before a settlement. We had some discussions with the landlord. It seemed like it was going to go okay. And he decides to say, well, we're going to have a 10-year lease with the purchaser. However, since there were 2 years left on the existing lease of the seller, he wanted to keep the seller on for the 2 years. And he also wanted to keep the seller on for the remaining 8 years of the purchaser's lease, because what they did, they did 2 years left. They made a 10-year lease, so 8 and 2 equals 10. That's what happened. So consequently, no one was really happy. So after weeks of going back and forth with the landlord, it was almost 3 weeks. The bank was saying, hey, we got to close because we have a certain date. We have to have this loan, this money by. So make a long story short, the landlord relented and said, I'll only make you responsible for the term, your remaining term. And the seller said, I can deal with that. I don't have another 8 years. Well, guess what happened? The purchaser got sick and tired of this back and forth. She wanted to move on. And all of a sudden, she started to develop a distrust and a dislike for the landlord and said, I don't want to be a tenant. I don't want this person to be, because if he would do this to the seller, what could he do to me if I want to stay here for more than 10 years? So walked away from the deal. So now the practice is back on the market and hopefully we'll find another buyer. But that just happened literally about 45 days ago. So there were not a lot of happy people, to say the least. Here's another one. This is in California, where in the San Francisco area, the seller's lease stated a potential new lessee must have at least 50% of the net assets of the seller, or the seller is liable for 5 years after the sale. Well, the seller didn't want to be liable 5 years after the sale, right? They wanted to get their money and move on. This was a premier practice in the Bay Area. So guess what? Kept looking. Our broker kept bringing qualified, what he thought were qualified purchasers. Qualified by that, I mean, they could be fully funded by any lender, right? However, their balance sheets weren't at the level that the landlord wanted. So 5 potential buyers went by. This doctor wanted to retire, and a year and a half later, finally, we found a purchaser who owned her own practice in real estate and had a sizable balance sheet. And the landlord finally said, okay, we can do the deal. But that seller who wanted to sell, who could have sold over a 1.5 year period, the 5 potential people fully qualified couldn't do it because of that ridiculous requirement. So that's one for the books. Now here's a sad
buyers.
Pardon?
Yeah, how many buyers are going to have even close to the net assets?
Oh, it just doesn't. It doesn't work that way. So our final case is an interesting one. Eric mentioned about month-to-month leases, and when I see a month-to-month lease when we're valuing a practice, guess what? That's going to increase the risk on one of our valuation methods, and that's going to lower your value. It's for obvious reasons. Why would I give a practice a premier number when we know that a month-to-month is deadly? So it's going to hurt your value just from a valuation point of view. But here was a situation where one of our brokers had 6 candidates and they wanted to sell their practice. And this all happened around since COVID, where we had some older doctors, most of them were older, and a lot of older doctors, were thinking about selling before COVID, but even more so after COVID, because they didn't really want to deal with shutdowns and things of that nature. So went through 6 particular doctors who had month-to-month leases. And of course, they all found out, to their dismay, that no buyer was interested, nor was a bank interested in dealing in situations where there was no lease with options to renew. So bottom line was, all these doctors ended up doing record sales or just walking away. And they didn't want to put up with any other aggravation, but they all regretted. They said, we wish we would have known how important it was to have a properly prepared lease, especially without these kinds of month-to-month terms, which they thought was a good thing because they didn't want to have that long-term liability. So these are the kind of things that we see in the real world when we try to sell your practice. And hopefully, because of tonight's information, motivates you to make sure if you are far enough away from selling your practice, you take some proactive steps to make things work. Next slide, please. So obviously, in a planning mode, and Eric, with the points that he raised were so strong that we want to make sure this lease is assignable and transferable to a qualified purchaser without any strings. And what that really means is you got to take a look at your lease. And I wonder how many of you who are sitting in this audience tonight have looked at your lease in the last year or the last 2 years. And if you haven't done so, I know it's summer and the weather is nice, but I want to give you a homework assignment. And I'd like you to read your lease over the weekend and jot down any points of concern that Eric raised tonight. And if so, be in touch with him and see if they can give you some guidance so that you can avoid some of these tragedies that occur with leases, because they really, really do. And, especially if the sale of your practice is an important financial event where, well, if I sell my practice or I don't sell my practice and get maximum value, I'm okay financially. But a lot of doctors really need every dollar that they can get from their career's involvement in being an owner of a dental practice. So as the old adage goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So I hope that we've given you some incentive to really, really take a look at your lease and be proactive and not sit back and make something happen so that you won't be compromised when it's time for you to go through your practice transition, as well as get maximum value for your practice. So thank you for inviting me to share some of my thoughts tonight, Eric. And I guess for now we're ready for some Q&A.
Absolutely. Dr. Schneider, that was, again, key points. Great to hear it from that perspective. We've got an additional poll and then some Q&A. So we've already got a whole host of questions that have come through. We did allocate the next 5, 10, 15 minutes to make sure we answer as many questions as possible. So as mentioned, final exit poll here, are you presently a tenant with a lease today? Do you know when your lease does expire? If you are in a month-to-month situation, if you are looking to sell in the near future and you're not sure about your lease, please note that the situation is urgent. And then, of course, from that perspective, one of our team will be in touch very soon to help coordinate the lease review and rental rate analysis. Even if you're just not sure you own, right, it's still important to have your lease looked at, and also very important to know what your current market rates are, especially for those that own. Perfect. So again, the Q&A section, I see we still have a massive host of people here. So let's jump into some of the Q&A, and this could be directed to one or both. So first question that came in a little earlier. If you rent a dental office to another dentist several days a week that has 3 ops and about 2,200 square feet, how much should we be charging in the suburban Chicago area? So I think this is a good question about, looks like a subletting type of scenario. So just maybe answering that at a bit of a high level, I think that's more directed to me, is that in that situation, if you are subletting that space, first of all, does the landlord know and have they given you written consent of that? The landlord, as we touched on, they could terminate your lease if it is an unapproved sublet, no different than an unapproved assignment. Right? So that's important. Number 2 is a lot of you may have 1099s working in your office. The landlord equally could deem that they are other businesses coming into your space, generating revenue, and the landlord could either A, use that per the assignment section to hold you in default, or more likely use it as an option to raise rent. So be cautious of that. So, doctor, from that perspective, I would suggest First of all, requesting the lease review, we can pull up the market rates and also get a better sense. Is there a cost sharing agreement in place, right? If it's 3 operatories and it's 5 days, how exactly does that work for you? Next question that came through, again, we're just going through the Q&A versus the chat. Next question that came through, can these terms be changed when renewing for the first additional 5 years? If so, how much can they be to negotiate? So from that perspective, Daniel, yes, the net of it is one of the main times we see as the best times to renegotiate is if you're mid-career and 5 years in or 10 years in or 15 years in. Quite frankly, the best thing to do is to negotiate early, start 2 years out prior to renewal. And yes, treat it as if it's a new 10-year term, right? Don't just keep exercising those options. You're sort of like imagine a pirate walking to the end of the pirate plank, right? The gangplank. Right? If you keep exercising those options and you come to Tom to say, okay, I'm ready to sell, suddenly now you've just exercised your last 5-year option, you've got nothing left, right? So typically our guidance is to complete renegotiations prior to that option to renew deadline, which can be 12 months prior to your expiry, right? And to also make sure, typically start with a new 5 or 10-year term, right? And then negotiate an additional 2 5-year options. Always good to have a running 15 or 20 years worth of runway, again, to ensure that you've got predictability and continuity from that. From that perspective, bringing in a partner. So Dr. Snyder, maybe from that perspective, we talked about subletting and then also about a partner. So I think those are 2 relevant questions. Perhaps you can touch on some of those either from a valuation perspective or best practices for those contemplating selling in the future. Should they bring in someone to sublet part of the space, or what impact would they have if they do bring in a partner?
Okay. Subletting usually is that there's an easy out clause with a sublet. With a partner, that's more of a long-term relationship because you're really financially bound, unlike in a sublet arrangement. And typically, and you know this better than I, Eric, the terms of the sublet could be more short-term, obviously, than a partner. But partnerships are like marriages, and sometimes they're easy to put together, and I put together quite a few, but they can be very difficult to take apart. And that I would think that as long as, you have to look at how long you want that partnership to last. Are you 40 years old and you want to bring someone in? If you want to practice for another 20 years, that's a 20-year relationship. Not saying that won't work. It can. We try to make partnerships that work, but sometimes things happen because people change over time. And when you're in a sublet arrangement, much more controllable and short-term, in my opinion.
And the last point I'd add to that question, Daniel, is that if, from a lease perspective, if you're bringing in a partner, and let's say it's 50-50, be very careful of the assignment section that could trigger the change of control, meaning that the landlord would have to approve that change of control. And if you sell or you sell a majority share and the landlord has not approved the transfer, well, again, that can create a whole host of additional problems, defaults or otherwise. So as you're contemplating partnership or subletting or even bringing in 1099s, very important that you've looked through all aspects of it and really do your planning in advance. Perfect. Okay, next question. Again, lots of Q&A here. We'll keep this open and cover them as long as possible. No Bucks game tonight, so we've got Adam for a few extra minutes here. Scott's question here. I own my own building via looks like a family LLC, 4-year time horizon for retirement. What resources do you have to help have a slam dunk lease agreement for my LLC? So it's a win-win for the buyer and DDS practice and LLC. Thank you. So Scott, from that perspective, yes, part of what we do is from an advisory perspective is to have a lease creation service. And it's very helpful to have that structured well in advance to be that win-win, but also give you enough control. So for those of you that own your own building, you need to ask yourself some tough questions, right? What sort of revenue do I expect? What happens if property taxes go up dramatically? Do I want a triple net lease, or do I want a gross, or do I want a modified gross lease? What happens if that doctor I sell to sells a year later and flips it, right? What happens if maybe the doctor wants to pick up and relocate and they want to take out all the gear and, you know, rip out all the nice AEDEC cabinetry you've put in, right? Or what happens if that new doctor wants to paint all the walls fluorescent green, right? That would despise you, or tear up certain things that you worked so hard to build. So you need to really start thinking from a full-time landlord's hat perspective, and to think about what you want that to look like post-sale. And I know that might seem a ways off, but yes, we do have some great slam dunk leases for your quote. Dr. Snyder, we didn't cover that too much, but your guidance of the importance of the lease for those that own their building today, what can you share there?
As far as
so for doctors, for example, for Scott here as an example, so for the doctors that own their building, own their practice, but want to maintain ownership of the building, let it be through the lease or any other best practices you can share.
Certainly. Well, yeah, of course. Look at it. It's a financial asset. It's a cash generator. And, you know, many doctors we find who are sole owners, when they sell their practice, if they retain the building, they have a source of income, which they really didn't have before, because they were always paying out of one pocket to the next. So if you have a long-term lease, that's not a bad thing in lieu of selling. So if it's really a financial decision. If you really are at a stage in your life where you have to liquidate assets, that's one thing. But if you're in a position where you're looking at that lease, that could be part of your retirement income stream, and it could be fairly significant, particularly if you're not leveraged. So, you know, owning a building, even though you have the liability of the ownership, you can always have a property management team and do all the hard work and heavy lifting, and you basically just maintain it and keep it, and good cash flow for a long period of time.
Great. Scott, hopefully that helps you there. Next question, how about building associations? We own the building, but under building complex association, any stories, issues with associations? So in short, yes, we were involved with one in not too far from where I used to live in Southern California, in LA County. And yes, they can be complicated because depending on how the complex or the co-op or the association is managed, maybe there's significant upcoming costs. Maybe they need a whole bunch for a reserve fund. Maybe there's issues with the building. Obviously, lots of that in the news these days, tragically. So there's a lot of components there that might impact what the future expenses may be. So it's less of an issue of assignment, but it's still an element of, do I want to maintain ownership of the unit? And in many cases, look, the reality is the doctor just can't get that high degree of getting the full practice loan, right? Plus their student debt, plus car debt, plus a mortgage, plus now an extra mortgage on the unit or the building. So in many cases, it's just not in the cards. So in some cases, yes, same thing applies. Proper planning, structuring a well-structured dental specific lease that you can use for yourself, and heaven forbid something were to happen to you, right? Your spouse or estate can use that exact same lease to transfer. So it's a smooth transfer, and they can realize, you know, that exact same significant passive form of income Dr. Snyder just referenced. Okay, good. Next question from Anonymous here. What is a typical interest rate on dental loans? So from that perspective, if we're looking at acquisition loans or real estate or otherwise, maybe just answering that from a high level, I have seen certainly some flyers from many of the major banks these days that are very aggressive to make up for lost time from last year. So I've seen rates below 3% with fixed. I've seen new programs that are upwards of 15 years for fixed rates. But again, it's not the purpose of today, but dependent on a whole other scenarios. But as Dr. Snyder mentioned, money is incredibly cheap these days. So if you're looking at that from a Rockefeller perspective, or you're an associate, it's been a very tough time being an associate for the past year or two, especially as, right, the GP or the owner has been, gobbling up all the good work. And that's why you're looking to finally make the decision to purchase.
I think in the mid threes is probably a safe number. As you correctly said, banks are vying for each other's, for everybody's business, so they'll make deals, and it all depends on the financial strength of the borrower, because the stronger they are, the better deal they can possibly get. But it's still, when you think about what practice acquisition loans were 10, 15 years ago, it's low. And whether it goes lower remains to be seen. I don't think so, but I don't see it going through the roof in the near term either. So for those young doctors out, or younger practitioners that were sitting on the sidelines, now's the time to buy a practice, because you get a good deal of the bank, without a doubt.
Dr. Snyder, question about valuations here and next steps. So Dr. W, I have an associate who has been with me for 5 years and now wants to become a partner. Where do I go from here? Okay.
Question is, when was the practice valued? Was it ever valued? If it hasn't been valued, it should be valued now. But one of the issues that may come up from the associate's point of view is, how much did that practice grow in revenue from the time they became an associate to the time they want to become a partner? Classic case of, I helped build the practice, I've established goodwill, should I pay full price? The answer to that question is probably not. So even though you didn't do a valuation years ago, you can really offer what we call a production discount to give them some type of goodwill credit for what they've developed. And that sometimes depends on their compensation structure. If you paid somebody a guaranteed salary for all those years and gave them a lot of perks, maybe that discount isn't as great as maybe someone who's been paid more of a market rate. But that's always a big question with existing associates is, what have you done for me lately? I don't want to pay for all that particular growth that's going on, because remember, most doctors should make 30 to 35% profit margin on their associates if they're fully employed. So, that has to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, great question. I mean, similar guidance on the lease is a similar type of thing. First of all, you've got to figure out if you want to. If I'm reading between the lines, the associate's approaching you, you might not be that excited to do it. So, part of the transitioning and the thought process should be, what's right for you, right? Is this someone that you can see as a partner in a long-term marriage? You've obviously had some time together, right? And are you making the decision for the right reason? If the associate says, look, I want partnership, or I'm going to go down the street and open a clinic right next door, right? These are the type of things that you want to consider all the options and figure out exactly, again, what's right for you, what's right for the practice, what does the growth look like? And then obviously making sure you've leveraged the right, merger and acquisition lawyers, et cetera. From a lease perspective, similarly, depending on percentages and the assignment clause, and also what that looks like for liability, not a bad idea if you've got a partner coming in to then have both doctors or both doctors' corporations on the lease, right? It shouldn't just be, you that's on the hook, right? Or on the hook post sale, right? When they are also a partner. There was a quick question, and I own my own office building and want to sell my practice. We didn't get the rest of that question, so feel free to repose that one. So we'll keep going. Feel free to repost that. John has a question here. I have a triple net lease. Landlord likes 5-year renewals. My lease expires August 31st of 2021. Oh boy. It looks like John's going to give me a call this evening. Was going to close this location and move the practice. Landlord is aware that I would like to go month to month in April. Things changed. The move fell through, and I'd like to sell the practice. So the lease is key, and I'm going to need guidance here. So yes. So from that perspective, John, what is important is to look through what the current lease is, to to look through what the current market rates are. And look, from a glass half full perspective, we've seen this scenario very many times before. It can also look at it from a new perspective, right? To treat the landlord already thinks you're on the way out. Maybe before they bring someone else in, it's important to get to that landlord fast before they say, whoops, I've actually already signed it for someone else. More importantly, is to look at, a shorter term. Maybe it's a 3 or a 5 year term with 2 5-year options would be ideal. So it's 15 years of predictability that Tom can go to the buyer to say, okay, good news, right? You've got 15 years of assurance that the landlord's not going to bring in the bulldozers. So that certainly with an August 31st expiry, there is certainly no time to spare on that front. So Dr. Higgins, feel free to the number on the screen as an info at, and I'm happy to respond to any emails late into the evening as Adam knows. So happy to assist there. Suma, my lease expires in 5 years and I would like to retire and do not want to renew. I would like to sell my practice to a good dentist. When do I start the process? Perfect one, Dr. Snyder. So lease is expiring in 5 years, would like to retire, don't want to renew the lease. I do want to sell the practice to a good dentist. What do I do to start the practice? So it sounds like I don't want the liability of a long-term lease, but my buyer certainly does.
Well, certainly within 5 years, I'd start thinking about it now. If you have someone in mind, that's one thing. But if you don't have anyone in mind, it could take a little while to find the proper candidate. I think just for starters, if you haven't had your practice valued, I would certainly get your practice valued just so we can tell you what we think it's worth in the open market relative to your plans. It maybe you don't really care what the value of your practice is because maybe you don't need those assets for a successful retirement. But if in fact you do, it's best to know where you stand. And if perchance we find that the value isn't what you would like it to be, how could we help you improve your positioning? There's a lot of things on the practice management side. The valuation can really reveal as far as some weaknesses, high overhead, other things that we could look at that may be able to give you some direction to improve your practice over the next few years and increase your value, notwithstanding the fact that I wouldn't wait till year 4 to look for a candidate, because we could possibly help you. But what if we go through 3 candidates and it takes 4, 5, or 6 months? The clock is ticking. So it begins with evaluation. The dialogue can start, and we can begin to take a good look and advise you accordingly about the next steps along the path.
Great point. Again, there's still the vast majority of attendees are still through here. So I just remind you, if you do have any extra questions or pressing questions, feel free to pose or email us directly. One additional point, looking through reading between the lines through some of these questions. The other thing I would remind you as you're looking towards transition is it's self-reflective and perfectly normal to be a little selfish to say, of course, I don't want a month-to-month lease. But use this as the opportunity and what Dr. Snyder suggested, which is, again, look at it through the eyes of the buyer. Right? What's going to be important to that buyer? How is Tom going to help to position your practice to help maximize that value? So think about things such as, again, exclusivity. Right? What's the value for that buyer to be the only dentist in that nice strip mall? Right? What type of work are they going to be doing? You might be just doing, general, right, with a little endo, perhaps a little perio, but no ortho. So they say, you know what, I don't really mind if an orthodontist, moves in the future. But again, what if that new orthodontist moves in next door? And this happened in LA, where the incoming doctor had professional representation, negotiated exclusivity over the subspecialty of orthodontistry. Right? Immediately impacting the production and revenue from that GP's practice that had been there for 15 years. So again, look at it not only from your perspective, but also the buyers. Right? What's going to be important to them? What's term? What's rent? Right? Can you leverage the current market conditions now and the high degree of vacancies to give yourself that ability to grow and to lock in at the best rates possible. In addition to that, the other question I would ask is, what about growth? Is there an ability to add something like a right of first refusal, for example, to give the doctor, right, yourself or the future doctor, the ability to expand into the adjacent suite, right? That death and disability clause, is that transferable to the buyer, or is it just good for you? Those options to renew, are they transferable, or is it just good for you? All of these type of things are unfortunately hidden in the fine print, but very important that you know and you're aware of, so that as, right, the buyer's professional team does their due diligence, they can easily go through that. And we get involved with that every day of getting lease flipped to us and say, what do you think, right? And what are my risks coming in as a buyer? So hopefully that covers those sections. That was one thing we missed from before. Perfect. Well, we've gone 17 minutes over. Adam, we appreciate your extra time. If there's not any additional questions, let me be the first to pass on a heartfelt thanks to Dr. Tom Snyder for joining us this evening and really sharing some of his candid feedback as to the importance of the lease and how to maximize your practice sale proceeds. If you have not had your practice valued before, I strongly suggest emailing ppt@henryschein.com. If you have not had your lease reviewed before, I would certainly strongly suggest emailing us at info@siriusconsultinggroup.com, and we're happy to do that as well. One additional question that came in just under the wire. In 2020, 2021, I negotiated a new lease, 10 years with 2 5-year bumps, and relocated my practice and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a brand new build out with all new equipment. My associate wants to buy in. How does this compute? So that's a bit of a valuation one as well, Dr. Snyder, maybe to take that one through. So we've now got a doctor that has the long 10-year term, 2 5-year options, 2 5-year bumps, and relocated my practice, spent hundreds of thousands to relocate and brand new build out. My associate wants to buy in. How does that compute? So again, that's a bit of a question about valuation and the associate, especially after a massive capital injection into the business.
So the associate wants to buy in now?
It appears, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Why don't you what happened? It's getting a little dark out here. I had to put a light on. So I apologize. Maybe we could redo that question because I was distracted because it was starting. I could see I was starting to disappear on the screen. Technical problem there.
No troubles at all. Just to wrap this up, final question. So in 2020 and 2021, I negotiated a new lease, 10 years with 2 5-year bumps options, and relocated my practice and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a brand new build out with all brand new equipment. My associate wants to buy in. How does that compute? So, yes, the associate's looking to buy in now. The doctor has gone through all the headache, pain, and anguish to relocate the practice, right? Building out the Taj Mahal. And now the associate says, great, now that all the work's done, I want in.
Okay. Well, obviously, if there was never evaluation done, evaluation could be done to see how the numbers fall. Another question I would have is, if there's been a lot of build out, is there a separate entity? And are those leaseholds and build out costs embedded in the real estate entity? If that's the case, then it becomes a rental issue. For a partnership, there may be a higher rent is required. So that way there's a return on investment. Versus if it's not in the real estate entity and it's in the practice, then we have to look at the value of those tangible assets, which would have some value, and they should pay for that because there is a benefit. So it really, because a lot of times when we value practices, if the real estate is a separate entity, typically those build outs should be in that real estate entity. So a proper fair market rent might cover off with a profit margin what the owner would charge, versus if it's in the practice, then you've got to look at the market value of all the equipment and the leaseholds, and that's something they have to pay for.
Perfect point. Hopefully, Dr. Wood, that helps out there. And Dr. B, we did see that in terms of request for valuation and follow-up from Dr. Snyder. And if there's questions about the lease, we'll certainly make sure that gets to the right team on the PPT side for evaluation for your upcoming sale next year. Fantastic. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Snyder. Thank you for your extra time.
Thank you
Hopefully
very
that was
much.
helpful for everyone. And we'll pass it back to you, Adam.
Great. That's all I got. Info's on the screen there if anyone wants to contact the Cirrus team or Practice Transitions team. If anyone's interested in attending future Henry Schein webinars, henryscheindental.com/webinars for our upcoming schedule. Tonight's webinar was recorded, so that'll be sent out within 1 week of tonight. And with that, we will end. So thanks for attending and have a great night, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody.
Take care.